In silence, thousands of people live in an invisible psychic prison, the compulsion to absorb the pain of others as if it were their own. They feel emotionally responsible for everyone around them, family, partners, friends, co-workers, and without realizing it, they become human sponges, soaking up the suffering of others and drowning in pains that don't even belong to them. At first glance, this seems like empathy. It seems noble, even admirable. It seems altruistic. But Carl Gustav Jung saw something much deeper and infinitely more dangerous behind this pattern. According to Jung, this behavior does not arise from genuine compassion. It arises from an unconscious impulse rooted in unhealed emotional wounds. He called this the wounded healer complex, a psychic configuration that leads the individual to seek out the suffering of others as a way to avoid confronting their own internal pains. Helping becomes an escape. Suffering for another transforms into a psychological anesthetic to avoid facing one's own traumas. And so the empathetic person begins to carry burdens that are not theirs, without understanding why they feel constantly exhausted, overwhelmed, or emotionally drained. This dynamic often originates in childhood, when the child grows up in unstable environments surrounded by emotionally unbalanced adults. To survive, they learn to regulate the environment around them. They become helpful, intuitive, hypervigilant to the mood changes of those nearby. They develop what Jung called an auxiliary ego, a false identity shaped not by their own authentic desires but by the desperate need to be needed. They grow up believing that if they are not there to fix others, they will have no value at all. Throughout life, this pattern disguises itself as empathy, but operates as an internal prison. The person emotionally merges with those who suffer, loses their own boundaries, and enters a state that Jung described as primitive psychic fusion, where the self and the other become indistinguishable. They feel what the other feels, they suffer what the other suffers, and they believe that this is love. But it is not love. It is emotional confusion. It is dependence disguised as compassion. In this video, we will dive deep into this complex and little explored territory of the psyche. We will understand how this mechanism forms, why it perpetuates itself, and most importantly, how Jung believed it was possible to free oneself from it. If you have ever felt that you carry burdens that are not yours, if you live absorbing the pain of others as if it were a personal mission, this video may completely change the way you see yourself and your relationships. You are not here to save anyone, and when you stop trying to save the whole world, that is when you truly begin to heal. The wounded healer complex, when helping becomes escape. Throughout his clinical observations, Carl Jung identified a recurring pattern in people who feel an almost obsessive need to help others, even at the devastating cost of their own well-being. They define themselves as extremely sensitive, empathetic, naturally supportive. They are often seen as too good, inherently altruistic people whom everyone turns to when they are unwell. But Jung saw in this behavior something very different from genuine empathy. What he found was a deeply rooted unconscious psychic drive, what he called the wounded healer complex. This complex is formed when a person, instead of dealing with their own emotional wounds, develops a compulsion to save others. It is a sophisticated psychological escape, a mechanism where helping others becomes a way to anesthetize their own internal pain. The pain of others serves as a distraction, a way to avoid the void within. The more suffering they find in others, the less they need to confront the emptiness they carry within themselves. This pattern often solidifies early on, usually in dysfunctional family contexts. The child, placed in an environment where adults are not emotionally stable, learns to regulate the emotions of others as a means of survival. They intuitively realize that they need to be helpful, caring, and constantly attentive because the instability around them depends on their ability to maintain order. Thus, they become too responsible for their age, taking on burdens no child should carry. This child grows up without learning to take care of themselves. Instead, they learn to exist for the sake of others. Jung explained that in this type of psychic structure, the person loses the fundamental ability to differentiate what is theirs from what belongs to others. They feel the emotional states of those around them as if they were their own. This creates a profound emotional confusion where the suffering of others is experienced as if it were personal. There is no longer a clear separation between I and the other. The individual enters a state of emotional fusion and comes to believe that their role in the world is to alleviate the pain of others at any cost to themselves. But here lies the most dangerous point that Jung wanted us to understand. This dynamic does not heal anyone. On the contrary, it makes both the one who carries and the one who is carried psychologically sick. When a person takes emotional responsibility for another, they prevent the other from developing psychic maturity. By anticipating the pain of the other, by bearing its consequences, by constantly alleviating their suffering, they make them dependent, emotionally infantilized. At the same time, they themselves sink progressively into exhaustion, frustration, and silent resentment that they often don't even recognize as resentment. Jung referred to this type of relationship as deep emotional codependence, a symbiosis where neither party actually grows. The savior maintains their illusion of being necessary and indispensable. The saved never develops their own internal resources. Help becomes, in fact, an obstacle to genuine transformation, a disguise of generosity that masks a dynamic of control, fear, and self-denial. If this content is making sense to you, please subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue this work. The auxiliary ego, the false self built to be needed. The compulsion to carry the pain of others does not arise from nowhere. Behind it, almost always, there is a silent story of early adaptation to the suffering of others. Jung observed that often people who become emotionally hyper-responsible in adulthood were forced to mature too early in childhood. Instead of being cared for, they learn to care. Instead of being seen, they learn to observe. Instead of developing a healthy sense of identity, they built something Jung called an auxiliary ego, a compensatory emotional structure that takes the place of the true self. The auxiliary ego is a form of identity built entirely around the need to be useful, to be needed, to maintain the emotional stability of the environment. The child does not learn to ask themselves, "Who am I?" They learn to constantly feel, "What do others need me to be?" And over time, this adaptation becomes their apparent personality. They transform into someone who feels before the other feels, who anticipates needs, who regulates the environment like a human emotional radar. But all of this comes at a devastating cost. They never discover who they really are outside of that role. This formation of the auxiliary ego usually occurs in homes, where one of the caregivers is emotionally unstable, absent, or excessively dependent. The child perceives, even without knowing how to put it into words, that the adult's well-being depends on their behavior. And so they mold their entire emotional expression to avoid causing more stress. They avoid crying, avoid asking for what they need, avoid expressing anger, because they learn that their emotions are dangerous or inconvenient. They become the good child, the mature one, the strong one, the one who never causes trouble. But inside them, the true self is being slowly suffocated. The problem is that throughout life, this structure does not disappear. It strengthens and calcifies. The individual begins to identify completely with this role of caregiver, peacemaker, counselor, emotional support. They believe that this is who they are at their core. But in reality, this identity was constructed as a shield, a survival mechanism that later transforms into an emotional prison. They become unable to say no, to set boundaries, to prioritize their own needs. They feel crushing guilt when they try to distance themselves, anxiety when they are unavailable, and an irrational fear of being selfish when they think of themselves. This form of identity creates what Jung called pathological psychic permeability, a kind of fragility in the boundaries of the self, where the individual cannot clearly differentiate what they feel from what is induced by the environment. They absorb the mood of others like a sponge. A simple change in someone's tone of voice already alters their internal state. They feel constantly on alert, monitoring the emotional climate around them. This exhausts them completely. And the worst part, since this pattern is lived as something normal, as just who they are, they don't even realize they are being slowly consumed. Jung saw this configuration as a deep blockage in the process of individuation, that is, in the path of becoming who one truly is. As long as the auxiliary ego is in control, the true self remains dormant, hidden, suffocated by the need to be what others expect. And that is why so many people living in this pattern reach adulthood with chronic feelings of emptiness, frustration, and existential confusion. They did everything right. They helped, cared, were always present. But deep down, they don't know who they are, and they don't feel complete either. The good news is that this pattern can be undone. But for that, it takes courage to deconstruct the savior role, to abandon the illusion that personal worth lies in being needed, and to learn to sustain one's own identity, even if it means disappointing, frustrating, or distancing oneself from those who benefited from their emotional self-negation. Why saving others actually prevents their growth. One of Carl Jung's most perplexing discoveries about the hidden emotional dynamics in human relationships is this: by taking on another's pain, you are not saving them. You are preventing them from growing. This realization directly confronts the romantic ideal of unconditional help, total surrender, and limitless compassion. But psychologically, this type of help is an illusion and often a destructive one. Jung referred to this type of bond as psychic codependence, a symbiotic emotional entanglement in which both the savior and the saved remain emotionally stagnant, unable to grow. On the surface, it seems like a noble gesture. One person is willing to carry the emotional burden of another, to protect them from pain, to prevent them from facing the consequences of their own choices. But what is really happening, on a deeper psychological level, is mutual sabotage. The savior avoids their own internal confrontation by focusing obsessively on someone else's suffering. And the saved is never challenged to mature, because there is always someone who anticipates their pain, who cushions their fall, who cleans up their emotional mess. True help requires one thing that few are willing to offer: boundaries. And boundaries in emotionally symbiotic relationships are interpreted as betrayal, as abandonment, as cruelty. The person who has always relied on your support, your unrestricted emotional availability, your constant shoulder to cry on, will react with guilt, manipulation, or despair when you begin to withdraw. This happens because the relationship was not sustained by autonomy, but by dependence. And dependence is not love, it is fusion. It is imprisonment. It is the denial of individuality. Jung understood that this emotional symbiosis is not just a behavioral problem. It is a failure in psychic differentiation. When two people are trapped in a relationship where one emotionally carries the other, both remain in a state of psychological immaturity. The savior needs to be needed to validate their existence. The saved needs to be fragile to keep the savior close. It is an unconscious dance where no one becomes whole, where no one individuates. And the most dangerous part is that this pattern can last for years, even decades, slowly consuming vital energy, clarity, and authenticity. Decisions are made based on the other. Emotions are experienced in relation to the other. One's own identity begins to dissolve. What remains is a constant feeling of exhaustion, frustration, and guilt for wanting to leave. Guilt for wanting one's own space, for wanting to exist beyond the role assigned to them. But here is the truth that many avoid facing. Growth hurts, and allowing the other to grow also hurts. When you refuse to continue being someone's chronic emotional support, you force them to confront their own shadow. You compel them to develop internal resources they never needed to activate because they always had you as a crutch. This moment is uncomfortable, yes. It can generate conflict, distance, accusations. But it can also be the turning point that initiates real emotional maturation. Jung asserted that true compassion is only possible when there is psychic integrity. This means it is only possible to support another without absorbing their pain when you are centered in yourself. When you know who you are, where you end, and where the other begins. When help does not come from the need to be needed, but from the lucid presence of someone who does not need to save to feel worthy. Conscious differentiation, the path to healthy compassion. Breaking the impulse to emotionally carry others does not mean becoming cold, selfish, or insensitive. Contrary to what many believe, maintaining a healthy emotional distance is not a lack of compassion, it is psychological maturity. Carl Jung called this ability conscious differentiation, the skill to recognize and sustain one's own internal states, without confusing them with the emotional states of those around you. Consciously differentiating is ceasing to be an emotional sponge and becoming a centered observer. It is the process of reclaiming one's own psychic individuality after years or decades of emotional fusion with another. It means feeling with the other but not for them. Being present in another's pain without that pain invading and destroying one's own internal boundaries. This is one of the clearest signs of a psyche that has begun the path of individuation. It can love without dissolving. It can help without negating itself. It can sustain without collapsing. But to reach this point, it is first necessary to recognize when you are operating from the wounded savior complex. Jung believed that this compulsive identification with another's pain almost always reveals an internal deviation, the unconscious desire to avoid one's own shadow. Therefore, the first step of conscious differentiation is radical self-questioning. Whose pain am I feeling? Is what I am carrying really mine? Or am I repeating the old pattern of absorbing others' suffering to avoid facing my own? From this point, a process begins that involves emotional discipline and internal vigilance, learning to return to others what belongs to them, not with indifference, but with clarity. This can be done through conscious practices, pausing before reacting, perceiving sensations in the body, identifying emotional triggers, and above all, cultivating a solid identity outside the caregiver role. Jung knew this was not easy. The impulse to save is strong, especially for those who have built their entire self-esteem on being needed. But he also warned that without differentiation, there is no true relationship. What exists is fusion, projection, confusion. Only when two people maintain their individualities intact can they meet in a real way without dependency, without demand, without manipulation disguised as care. One of the deepest aspects of conscious differentiation is the courage to allow the other to face their own consequences. This may mean watching someone you love fall, err, suffer, and still not intervening, because intervening in this case would be robbing the other of the chance to mature. True compassion, Jung said, requires strength. Strength to not confuse empathy with invasion, love with control, help with interference. At the center of this practice is presence, a clear presence that knows how to sustain another's suffering without absorbing it. This is only possible when the auxiliary ego begins to lose strength and the true self emerges. A self that does not need to be needed to exist. That does not feed on others' pain to feel alive. A self that has learned to say, I am here, but I am not you. This is the beginning of a new way of living. If what you're hearing resonates deeply, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day practical path. Both are linked in the pinned comment. What happens when you finally let go? When a person stops absorbing the pain of others, something profound happens, not only within them, but also in everything around them. Relationships change, bonds transform. What was once sustained by need, control, or emotional dependency begins to crumble. And in place of what was illusory, something rare emerges: authenticity. Letting go of carrying others' pain is not just an internal decision. It is a complete repositioning in how you relate to the world. For the first time, you allow yourself to exist as a separate, autonomous being with clear boundaries and a distinct identity. This breaks the logic of codependency. And yes, it is unsettling. Many around you will not accept this change immediately. They will accuse you of selfishness, coldness, indifference. But in reality, what they are feeling is the loss of the emotional control they once exerted over you, even if unconsciously. Jung understood that when we break away from the neurotic patterns that sustain our relationships, the surrounding system collapses. But this collapse is necessary. It is the beginning of a new internal and external order. The relationships that survive your liberation are those that were ready to evolve. Those that dissolve reveal that they only existed because you were negating yourself to maintain them. You begin to see more clearly which bonds were based on real love and which were sustained by disguised need. Relationships where you were only valued while saying yes, while being available, while carrying what was not yours. Now, by setting boundaries, by choosing not to absorb, you force the other to take responsibility for themselves. And this can be the greatest gift someone can receive, even if, at first, it feels like a loss. On the internal level, this liberation brings with it a profound sense of relief, mixed with grief. Relief because, finally, you can breathe without the weight of carrying everyone. Grief because you must mourn the identity you built around being the savior, the helper, the one everyone depends on. This mourning is necessary. It is the death of the auxiliary ego, making space for the true self to finally emerge. You discover that you have needs. You discover that you have limits. You discover that saying no does not make you a bad person. It makes you a whole person. And gradually something extraordinary happens. You become capable of genuine compassion. Not the compulsive, self-destructive kind that drains you, but the kind that comes from a place of fullness, of overflow. You can help others not because you need to save them to feel worthy, but because you choose to, from a place of strength rather than wound. This is what Jung called mature love, love that does not demand, does not consume, does not fuse. Love that recognizes the other as separate and allows them the dignity of their own journey, including their own pain. When you finally let go, you discover that you were never meant to carry the world. You were only ever meant to carry yourself. And in that realization, you find the freedom you were always seeking.